Salve Omnibus. This video is going to be a bit of an experiment, is that I'm trying out doing more unscripted videos, both because it's a bit easier and I really want to work on being able to think on my feet and come up with responses on the fly, especially when I'm in live streams, so I don't make a fool out of myself and I can come up with poignant things to say. So I'm going to try my best in this video about evangelical Christianity. Please don't be too harsh. I really want to get the practice done. And let's get started. So this video is more or less going to be an overall examination or explanation of evangelical Christianity, because it's something that my Catholic brothers and sisters in faith, like the distributists, have been asking me about and are very somewhat confused about the nature of evangelical Christianity. And so I really want to take the time to lay out what I believe evangelical Christianity actually is, what it was, and what it will be. And I think to start off is that I view evangelical Christianity, as a brief definition, would be a belief within Christianity that you're a Christian based not on what denomination you belong to, but on what you actually believe. That, the actual core theology of, the sort of C.S. Lewis mere Christianity beliefs is more important than what church you actually belong to, so that you can be a genuine so it doesn't really matter if you belong to a horrible rainbow color flag waving mainline Protestant church. You should probably get out of there, but you can still be a real Christian and still belong to that church. Or you can be a Catholic and not actually believe more or less a word of what Catholic belief actually states. You can completely ignore anything the church says, but you'd still call yourself a Catholic. And I think evangelical Christianity is sort of a useful way of determining who's an actual Christian, when you have the fact that you have certain, unorthodox or heterodox branches of Christianity with genuine Christians in them, non-denominational Christians who don't really belong to any church, and the fact that you have people that are in Orthodox Christian churches who are not real Christians. Now, I think that's a brief way of describing personally how I feel about evangelical Christianity. But I think to go over the history of it is, think of it like the Protestant churches as a desert, which a desert is actually, you wouldn't know it, but it's full of life. And, it's full of plant life, animal life. It's just somewhat dormant. And it needs the occasional desert rainstorm in order to be brought back to life and be able to sustain itself for the, next several months or how long it is before rain. And I think that's generally how you can look at past evangelical Christianity. It's essentially the Great Awakenings, these movements throughout history that were meant to revitalize and revive dying and heterodox churches, primarily in America, but also in Europe. And, you have many of the figures within this. You've had people like John Wesley and George Whitefield in England starting the Methodist movement in the 18th century. John Winthrop with probably called the First Great Awakening in the 1600s, correct me if I'm wrong, but, the establishment of the Christian Society in New England, of which my ancestors were more or less a part of. And, these movements throughout history were meant to revive the church. And a good example of what I mean by this is that in the early 19th century, after the defeat of Napoleon by the coalition, Protestant Christianity in particular was ripe for a revival because of the fact that you had so much of the influence from the Enlightenment of secular humanism and the infestation of deism into, philosophy, culture, and society. The fact, if you look at the statistics and the records at the time, abysmal church attendances in England and probably also America, bordering on how bad it is now. And so, this is because you had clergy in the church were going to be some of the more educated members of society over the lay Christians. The theology was dying away, in place of secular humanism and deism. And of course, this is very evident in the Founding Fathers. And I think this is perfectly exemplified in the disgusting Jefferson Bible, which basically takes out any bits of Christianity that Jefferson didn't think fit within classical liberalism and secular humanism. And so, given this, and the fact that you now have the ability to, because the Napoleonic Wars were over, and for the time being, the political embodiment of revolutionary Enlightenment ideas was dead and in the ground. that the French monarchy was restored, Napoleon was defeated, and the ancient regime was setting up a system to ensure that this could never happen again. And so you had, in the early 19th century, the Second Great Awakening, with a return to Orthodox Christianity, the beginnings of what the evangelical movement was, and churches within Europe and America more or less returned to orthodoxy. And, you had the rise of Victorian moral values with Charles Dickens and, Christmas Carol, and churches more or less were doing fine. Now, in addition to that, in times of great moral crisis, I think Christians should be allowed and should speak out on political issues. I generally think it's a very bad idea, because that's not our forte, that's not what Jesus commanded us to do. But I think with issues like slavery, segregation, and abortion, yes, there is absolutely a impetus and a virtue to speak out against these things. And the Second Great Awakening, much of the northern evangelical movement, was about opposing slavery as a horrible moral wrong. Same thing in England, that very firebrand opponents of slavery were also religious leaders. Now, the Third Great Awakening, in the late 19th century, came as a result of the sort of scientist movement, scientific materialism, Nietzsche-type atheism, Darwinism and social Darwinism, and the beginnings of progressive eugenics and Marxism. And this was something that was also much more widely addressed within the Catholic Church, within the Catholic Europe, with Pope Leo XIII and the beginnings of, the Catholic understanding of social justice, and G.K. Chesterton, who, even though he was still Protestant at the time, wrote orthodoxy as more or less a response to Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. If Nietzsche is the one who said God is dead, Chesterton is the one who said God is alive. And more or less, you had another revival movement that was bringing Christianity back to orthodoxy. Of course, this was completely interrupted, and faith in general religious institutions and other social institutions were smashed because of World War I, because of their overt support for World War I. Now, because the war was nowhere near as damaging to society in America as it was in Europe, and because I don't think churches were generally, you didn't have any state churches in America. The fact is, in America, the faith and trust in Christian religious institutions was more or less maintained, and I think that's also somewhat of a reason as to why America, even today, is a significantly more religious country than Western European nations. And you had another revival movement in the 20s and 30s, and then the final one, the one that is still kind of going on today, but it's undergoing a big transformation, happened in the mid-20th century after World War II, in the 50s and 60s, with people like Billy Graham, in that you had as a response to both fear of communism, to sort of distinguish America against the godless communists as being solidly Christian, and against, going into the 1960s, the sexual revolution, the counterculture movement. There's the old 60s protest song, Eve of Destruction by Barry McGuire, and he talked about how he was caught up in the Jesus movement of the 60s, which was really sort of, and it was a movement as a alternative to progressive sexual revolution hippie movement, as a solid Christian alternative. And a lot of people like Bob Dylan and Barry McGuire fell into that and this changed, though, from just being a movement to act as a counterbalance to the sexual revolution, becoming more and more like a group as it is now, because of two main reasons. One, the secularization of society, and two, the secularization of the church. Now, first on society is the fact that it couldn't really act as a counterbalance for forever, because of the fact that the reality was the sexual revolution and the counterculture movement of the 60s was not going away. It wasn't just some sort of odd, young next generation rebelling against their parents. This was something that was going to sustain itself for decades and decades, and it's still doing its damage up to this day. And so you had what was the beginnings of what a lot of Christians call the post-Christian society, a society in which it's not really established anymore that Christianity is the dominant religion or the dominant moral foundation. The evangelical movement had to move more and more towards a sort of group communal understanding of itself, rather than just being a movement to revitalize the church. Think about it like if you're a gardener, if it's summertime or spring or summertime, your main job is to water the plants to keep them alive. Well, if you think about progressive movement and the sexual revolution as being basically winter killing everything, nowadays what evangelical Christians have to do is be church planters. You have to actually plant the new seeds of churches rather than revitalize old ones. And the structure of a church and of a Christian movement that can do that is going to look much more like an actual group than it would be just a movement. Now, the second major reason why evangelical Christianity appears to be much more like a group than a movement nowadays, rather, is that mainline Protestant churches are very susceptible and sensitive to cultural change. Catholic churches as well, but because of the structure of Protestant churches as being having a much bigger impact of the lay Christians on them, they're going to be much more sensitive to cultural change, and that's why, when culture changed in the 1960s away from traditional understandings of sex and morality, churches began doing that as well, and that kind of culminated in the early 21st century when you started having churches genuinely go against Christian Orthodox belief with regards to the issue of homosexuality. And I think that's a very good watershed measure to see whether or not a Christian church has genuinely abandoned Orthodox Christian beliefs in favor of just appearing popular. Now, I think the good news about that is that if we can, and it's certainly possible, and there will be a cultural change, the progressive order can't last forever. It can last a long time, but it's not going to last forever. If, say, tomorrow, the sexual revolution was completely refuted, nobody, really supported it anymore, nobody wanted to have anything to do with, gay identity or any of the ridiculous letters and pronoun games, you'd see Protestant churches completely do a 180 and go back to Orthodox Christian beliefs. When in the 20th century these churches began moving further and further away from Orthodox Christian beliefs, you kind of had a need, you had a vacuum that needed to be filled for Christians who felt left out by this and wanted to have an authentic Orthodox Christian experience. And so you had the rise of separate evangelical churches. Now, I think a big criticism that Catholics seem to have about evangelical Christianity is that we have had a very bad image problem with the, seeing like the giant mega churches, the crappy movies we keep making, the televangelist, the prosperity gospel, and all that. And I would say that that's much like how people viewed the Catholic Church with its with the sex scandals, and that neither one were really representative of genuine Catholicism or evangelical Christianity. They were just the most interesting and sexy stories for the media. There were mistakes, and the people that were saying like Pokemon satanic or if you give me lots of money, then you'll go to heaven, those needed to have been rebuked a lot louder. And I think focusing on the culture war with marriage, it was a natural thing to do, but it was ultimately damaging to Christianity. What I think evangelical Christianity is doing right now is doing a lot of soul-searching and understanding what it actually is and what it should turn into. And I think what I would like to see would be an establishment of some form of centralized authority within evangelical Christianity to assert and maintain genuine orthodoxy over sex, over the Trinity, over basic theological issues, but still allow for a certain amount of autonomy for the local churches to have certain theological questions be left up to them, like on baptism or the liturgy. And I think the line here for me is you can do things which are unorthodox but not heterodox. You can't go against basic Christian teachings. You can certainly, have your own interpretations of should we have baptism as a full immersion or as, just sprinkling water. And these are certainly discussions and conversations I think are necessary and constructive. But I think, again, the evangelical understanding is that those things are somewhat more secondary to genuine, authentic Christian experience, the personal relationship with God, the born-again experience. And what I see as a lot of the major criticisms that Catholics seem to have of evangelicals are things that make sense as criticisms on paper, but don't actually turn out to be true, in the fact that I've studied the statistics, and evangelical Christians, the ones who identify as evangelicals or can be described as evangelical, are among the most socially conservative when it comes to views on sex and abortion. They have among the highest retention rates of any Christian group when it comes to their children, and they are the people that most frequently will read their Bibles. And certainly because of the decentralized and much more lay person-focused nature of Protestant Christianity, there is obviously, again, always that fear of that Catholics have with the fact that many Protestants, identified Protestants, are not actually Christians and are probably doing more, are kind of acting as parasites to Protestant Christianity. But the fact is, those churches are dying. The mainline Protestant churches, like the Episcopalians, like the Lutherans, like the Presbyterians, are dying, and alternative conservative evangelical ones, like the Anglican Church in North America, the Evangelical Reformed Presbyterians, the Lutheran Missouri Synod, those things are growing, and they are steady, and they are young and vibrant. And I think, back to my point, is that, yeah, certainly the lay nature of Protestant Christianity makes it so that what the lay Christians believe is going to be much more, have bigger impact on the actual teachings of the church. But it doesn't really seem to be the case, because of the fact that I think you're going to have a similar outcome in both Catholicism and Protestantism, in that the people that don't actually believe, and the non-Orthodox, are going to fall away and cease to actually be, considered Christians. And what you're going to be left with is a core group of Orthodox evangelical Christians and traditional Catholics. And so, because of the highly structured and centralized nature of the Catholic Church, it doesn't really matter so much, or it's not as much of a concern that, almost half of identified Catholics in America support gay marriage, that you have people like Andrew Cuomo or Nancy Pelosi who call themselves Catholics but are actively acting against direct teachings of the Catholic Church on marriage and abortion. And honestly, I think it would be a good idea if some form of legislative punishment was taken against them. But I would say evangelical Christianity is not dying. It's actually growing, if not steady. And I really hope we can mitigate any losses and much more efficiently and effectively allocate and manage our resources in terms of ministry, would be to get some form of centralized structure. Now, the only problem I'd have with that is, how do you deal with the fact that you have a few mainline Protestant branches which are still Orthodox, like the Southern Baptist Convention and the Anglican Communion? And I think that's a question that has to be answered. I don't really know the answer to it yet. But suffice it to say, I think for a lot of evangelical Christians and Protestant Christians, we would benefit immensely from having some form of organized central evangelical, if it's not a church, but just some organization. I think on a last note, I really need to take the time to rebuke and kind of apologize to a lot of Catholics for the problem of having a number of fundamentalist Protestants who believe that, Catholics aren't Christians, or Catholic Church is the Church of Satan, and, no Catholic can go to heaven and all that. And again, that to me really actually goes against explicitly what evangelical teaching is, which is that denomination is far less important than individual belief. You can be a, young, genuinely Orthodox, theologically sound Catholic, or a, Irish American, coming from the Irish Catholic background, but who's a complete kind of socialist, or somebody like the Pope, who is basically a Latin American socialist. And, there's obviously a big difference between those two people. Same thing with having a rainbow flag flying, waving, quote-unquote Christian like Hillary Clinton, or someone like me, who is an evangelical Protestant Christian, but there's a world of difference between the religious beliefs of me and Hillary Clinton. The same way, again, there is going to be between Tim Kaine and the Distributist. And so I think, to reiterate one last time, the focus is on beliefs, not denomination. And now that I've apologized sufficiently and whipped myself over the things that other people have done, is that I would ask in return that some of the traditionalist Catholics, tradcats, tone it down on the Martin Luther was Satan a bit. Protestant Christianity is a perfectly valid form of Christianity. Catholicism has never actually ever been the only form of Christianity. Look, we all believe in the resurrection, we all believe in the Bible, we all believe in salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We're all Christians, we should try and get along. And I think, ultimately, traditional Catholics like the Distributist and other people, and evangelical Christians like me, are completely on the same side in this culture war, and I think any sort of conflict needs to stop. So I think those are my musings, my ramblings, my mumblings on evangelical Christianity, what it is, what it was, and I think what I want it to become. We're not dying, we're fine, there's hundreds of millions of us, we're growing around the world. The big criticism that Catholics have is that, Protestant churches aren't unified by a centralized doctrine, how do they stay orthodox? Well, were they still be considered orthodox in the 19th century? More or less, yes. Almost all Protestant churches in America and Europe would have been essentially Orthodox Christians. It's just only after the massive cultural changes in the mid-20th century that also heavily damaged the Catholic Church as well, that actually got Protestant Christianity to start abandoning orthodoxy. And I think even that's going to go away because, again, the sexual revolution is unsustainable, and I think more and more people are going to start, especially in the millennial generation, especially the generation that follows us, are going to start understanding that abandoning basic sexual ethics and morality was wrong, and once you start seeing a major cultural change, Protestant churches are going to come around, and really any of these big issues are going to be solved. And I think on a last note, and if you've watched my videos, you'll probably know that I have a particular beef against, Orthodox Protestant Christians, but who hold a progressive view of race. And I think the biggest problem I have with that is it's more of a Trojan horse that lets in other progressive ideas like feminism and gay rights. So inadvertently, people who just wanted to be in support of what they see as racial injustice are gonna start ending up supporting heterodox beliefs. And that was probably not their intention, but the fact is, if you actually look at the statistics, as I point out in my classical illiberals video, the vast majority of evangelical Christians completely reject this narrative on race. It's just a few young journalism majors writing for a few publications. And when Black Lives Matter is finally publicly and widely discredited, they'll shut up. So I think on that note, thank you everyone for watching, and Diabana.
Wir wollen unseren alten Kaiser Wilhelm wieder. Wir wollen unseren alten Kaiser Wilhelm wieder. Aber den mit dem Bart, mit dem langen Bart. Aber den mit dem Bart, mit dem langen Bart. So schwärmten unsere Eltern von der guten alten Zeit. Sie liegt so fern und weit, die alte Kaiserzeit. Doch war sie wirklich besser, diese gute alte Zeit, als einst der Opa, die Oma hat wohl gefeit. Ja, mit Jagdgesang und mit Hörnerklang, rings um Fair Berlin, durch die Wälder ziehen. Ja, mit Jagdgesang und mit Hörnerklang, ritt die Oma mit dem Opa. Doch sie hielten an und küssten sich, sonst wären wir heute.